Very much for stopping by the Digital Creator Daily. If you're new here, I'm Rob from Hey Summit, and this is the daily-ish show where I get to have some awesome conversations with brilliant people doing really interesting things. We talk about the creator mindset, staying authentic, assembling your toolkit, exploring platforms, and more. It's a pretty relaxed show about and for creators, thought leaders, independent entrepreneurs, and those working in all areas of startups. And just a reminder, a conversation is best when it's shared. So however you're tuning in, whether it's live with us today or via the podcast later on, feel free to jump in with your questions, with your thoughts, your perceptions and perspectives. And thanks very much for spending a bit of time with us. So I'm really happy to welcome Kaitlin Christine to the show. Kaitlin's the CEO and founder of Gabbi, the first digital tool that accurately and inclusively predicts a woman's 2-year risk of breast cancer and equips her with a plan to take action and community support. Before starting Gabbi, Kaitlin was a national patient speaker and hereditary cancer specialist for the world's leading genetic testing company. Thanks very much, Kaitlin, for taking some time to chat with me today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on the show. Excited to be here.
Thanks. Well, and especially for waking up so early. So I kind of glossed over, I buried the lead there, but like, I'd love to learn a bit about Gabbi and the story that brought you to it, but specifically brought you to found it. But before that, I'd love to get back to the one part about you being a national patient speaker and hereditary cancer specialist. Like how did you get from there to here?
Yeah, well, it actually very much is part of my whole journey and my whole story of not only how I started Gabbi, but how I became a national patient speaker and a hereditary cancer specialist. So I was in my senior year of college and I was a food writer as well as majoring in theater. And my mom got sick with breast cancer. I became her full-time caregiver, and 8 months later, she passed. And by the end of that, what I was doing before just didn't matter to me anymore. And it was really hard to find meaning and purpose to get up in the morning. And then I found a lump in my breast. And again, like I'm only in my early 20s, and I just really discovered how difficult it was for me to get the resources I need to learn, to get care, which wasn't dissimilar from what my mom had experienced. And so it was like, oh my gosh, this is happening again. And I eventually made a decision to have a preventative surgery because I wasn't able to get the answer that I felt I needed. You know, it was being written off as you're too young, there's no way it could be breast cancer, that kind of thing. And so I had a preventative double mastectomy, removing all of my breast tissue. And in surgery, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I was only 24 years old.
Wow.
And so for me, that is when it was like I was going this path, and maybe I had stopped in this path and was trying to figure out what to do, still going on this path. And when that happened, it was like a complete 180 that I have to go into healthcare. I have to go into women's preventative health. And I didn't know what that meant. And I literally Googled all these different, keywords about women's health, young women, breast cancer, prevention, et cetera. And I stumbled across this nonprofit that was based in Chicago called Bright Pink. And they happened to they had a couple of job postings for what they called education ambassadors. So I applied. And it was kind of a whirlwind. Within 2 weeks, they were flying me out to Chicago, and I was selected to be a national education ambassador. And from there, I was then headhunted by Myriad Genetics, which at the time was the number one genetic testing company in the world. And they hired me to be a patient speaker. So then I was going around to different health systems, physicians, hospitals, speaking about my experience as a patient and how important it is to combine the science, which the physician provides, and the art, which the patient needs to provide. And they eventually moved me into a clinical role, and I became a hereditary cancer specialist.
So you obviously through personal tragedy, but also through your own I want to say education, but it seems like your lack of clear
Mm.
educational resources that's clearly that impassioned you to that lit the fire for your interest in healthcare. How though did you go from that? Because I could imagine that sounds like a really valuable, um, not only rewarding but critical voice that needs to be there. How did you go from that point to say, you know what, uh, I don't want to continue in this kind of environment. I think I can make a bigger difference outside of it.
Yep.
What kind of went into the mentality of you thinking, yeah, I want to start my own thing?
Great question. So once I moved into being a hereditary cancer specialist, the company actually moved me out to Portland, Oregon. At the time, I was in Denver, Colorado.
Okay.
So they paid for me to move to Portland, Oregon, the city that I'd never been. And for 2 years, I think a lot of the reason is it was new. You know, I'm learning, I'm having fun. And I start after, I'm like year 2.5, I start feeling like it's becoming monotonous. And the reason it's becoming monotonous is because every day my job is to go into these health systems and these private practices, and I'm educating them on the importance of hereditary cancer and preventative screening, and then hopefully helping them set up processes to screen and test their patients. And if they say yes, then that would mean that I would spend multiple days in clinic with them. And during that time, just seeing how much patients didn't know about themselves, how strapped for time physicians were, how everything was tied to a bottom line in a health system because there are now these administrators making these decisions, and it's about,
Mm.
Churn and burn, essentially. The more patients you see, the more money you make. And I started getting frustrated. So kind of this was not a conscious decision, but I started wherever I went just talking to women. So I'd be at a boutique or I'd be at a coffee shop or a restaurant, and can't even really remember how the conversation would start, but being a hereditary cancer specialist is pretty specific. So, I'd comment on her shoes or something, and she'd be like, oh, I love your blah, 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 blah. And then, what do you do? And I'd say a hereditary cancer specialist. And the response was typically like, oh, that's very specific. How did you get into that? And I'd give a little snippet of my story. And then inevitably she'd say, oh, my mom, my sister, my aunt, my grandmother, my brother, whoever had some kind of cancer. I've always been concerned, but when I talked to my doctor, they said either I'm too young or there's nothing I have to worry about right now. And I kept having these conversations where I was saying, that's not true. And I kept having these conversations. And after a few months, it felt like I had had hundreds. And my mind is just brewing. And eventually I was so fed up that, not very well thought through, I decided to quit my job because I was so frustrated. But I knew that I was going to figure out what I needed to do. I didn't know what it was, but I had this idea. And I went around for like probably 12 months sharing my idea. And as it evolves, sharing it over and over again with people, asking questions. And each time the questions got more specific, depending on the answers I got, I started holding focus groups. And eventually in like late 2019, it solidified into what is now Gabbi.
Awesome. And so when did you, so you said you quit your job out of frustration, and then you started doing the thing that everybody should be doing, which is testing assumptions, qualifying problems, falling in love with that problem, etc. At what point did you think, all right, this now should be a thing versus this could be something that could be a change somewhere else?
Yeah. So I think first thing to point out is I didn't know that I was testing assumptions
Yeah.
or
You're just talking.
doing user test. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. Looking back, that's what it was. I think I never had a doubt that I was going to do something. I was unsure of the magnitude, and I was unsure of exactly what it was going to be, but I always knew, I had no doubt that I was going to do something, and it was going to be in this space based off of all this information gathering. It wasn't until Honestly, I don't even know if I would say until we started getting significant traction from like a customer, because I still have doubts today.
Of
And
course.
it's not doubt about, whether or not I should be doing this. It's doubt on, holy hell, this is so hard. Like, am I trying to do something impossible? Am I trying to fit a square peg in a round hole? Am I making this more difficult than it needs to be? And of course, that spirals into, do people really want this? Is this really needed? Is this really solving a problem? And really, it's like all the imposter syndrome that you hear about. It's so true. And it starts, and if you don't shut it down immediately, it just spirals. So I don't know if I would say
You're there yet.
yeah. And
Yeah.
I'd be curious if even like, say, Jeff Bezos would even say like, oh, I know I'm there. I think
Yeah.
as founders, we're so hard on ourselves that, yeah.
Yeah. You need to be outwardly, you need to be surer than the sun, but inwardly, any chance of you having confidence in an idea probably means you haven't thought of something. Like that's this internal kind of
Right.
monologue. You're like, what am I missing? It's all
Right.
gonna fall apart. It's all
Totally.
gonna crumble.
Totally. It's
And
like, exactly. It's, and it, in a lot of ways, I think that's a hard part of being a founder, is we feel like we have to have these bipolar personalities, because outwardly, most of the time to the team, but certainly to everyone outside the company, you have to be obnoxiously optimistic. And then internally, I think as the founder, you have to be very pessimistic, challenging all the assumptions and thoughts, et cetera, because nothing's really true until it actually happens.
Totally. And so how did you make that? So you were having all these conversations, and I would definitely want to come back to kind of the feeling of like of loneliness that kind of probably brings or accompanies being a founder, and especially an early stage one. But you had these conversations. You decided, all right, this is going to be a thing. And then was Gabbi quite? So first off, I guess it would be helpful, like when you say Gabbi is a digital tool that accurately predicts a woman's risk of breast cancer. What is it? Like, what form does it take? And how did you decide on that as a format that might work?
Yeah. So my conversation started with people based off of three things. Actually, I would say two things. And the third thing developed during the testing assumptions and kind of discovery. So the first two things were always, women don't know their risks, so they need to know what their risks are. And then the second was, once you know your risks, you need to know what your options are so you can take action. So there was always this twofold of like, you need to know about your risks, and then you need to know what your options are and compelled to take action. The third thing that developed during customer discovery, if you will, was community. That women don't make decisions in silos. And in fact, when they're concerned about something or have a question, the first place they go is to another woman, whether it's their mom, their sister, their best friend. And so the community thing came on during that customer discovery. But before all of that, when it was just identification and understanding your options, I was going around saying that Gabbi was going to empower women to understand their bodies. So broad. But it would help do those two things. And during talking to people, the customer discovery, uncovering the third component, and really making things super, super complex, and then going back to what I actually learned as a hereditary cancer specialist, which is right now, a way a woman's risk is predicted is in a physician's office. It's in clinic. And there are these tools, they're breast cancer risk models that have been designed to, it's a software essentially. It asks you a myriad of questions and you input some data, the clinician does. And at the end, it gives you your lifetime predicted risk of breast cancer. And then some do your 10-year and your 5-year risk of breast cancer. That's great. And I was like, well, that's what we need to do. But the
questionnaire
face on
type
this
thing.
is so confusing.
Yeah.
You have to go to a physician. Now, why don't all these women know about their risks if they're all seeing physicians and the physicians all have access to these tools? Well, it turns out only 5% of clinicians are actually using these tools. So women aren't finding out their risks. So coming down to, okay, how do we put this in front of a woman so that she can have access to her own information? So that's where, we determined we needed to have a mobile app. And then we started looking at the accuracy and the demographics of these risk models. And turns out they're only appropriate for women who are over the age of 35, and they're only appropriate for white women. So those were obviously two inherent problems. And then the third was they're still not that accurate. So these models that are standard of care are at best like 63% accurate at predicting risk. So then it became, okay, is there a way for us to take this outside of the clinician's office and put it in the hands of women? But then also, how do we improve upon these so that we're not just predicting a 10-year and 5-year, but we're predicting something that's more actionable, more usable, like a 2-year risk, more appropriate for all women, and activates women. So what it is it's a twofold solution. It's an AI model. So we're using artificial intelligence, machine learning, by going into claims data and EHR data to predict a woman's risk. And then it's a mobile application that a woman uses, and she inputs more information about herself. And in combining those two things, we're able to provide the most accurate risk, give her a personalized action plan that helps guide her, tracks her as she takes steps, notifies her when she needs to do things, and then a community of support where she can talk to other women. She's grouped with women who have similar risks, and they're taking these steps along this action plan journey together.
So like you explaining that, it all sounds quite obviously incredibly impressive, but quite like, of course, yes, of course, that's the solution, right? And yeah, easy, right? And I know that your journey has not been that easy, but like how all the things that you've kind of articulated probably have hours and hours and days and months of work trying to get over as specific barriers. How did you get it from the idea of like understanding this is what was needed to being able to get this off the ground, and why did you approach it in the way that you did? Because I know that you've raised money for this. You've raised money for Gabbi. What went into the decision to construct the company in that way, to construct the tool that way, to work outside, not you're working with the system, but working outside of the system in a way? Why did you approach it in that way strategically?
So I've never started a company before. I was the co-founder of a nonprofit when I was in high school, but that's a very different game. And so this was my first rodeo entering down this path. And as soon as I stepped out into it, it was amazing how many entrepreneurs I just kept finding. And the first thing, and founders too, and the first thing the majority of them said was, oh, so like, when are you raising money? Are you raising money? How much are you raising? And all of a sudden, it almost seemed involuntary on my part that it was just like, oh, this is the route you're going to go. And while I was going down that route and received some not great advice when I was so early, I hit my head against the wall for a while trying to raise money when I shouldn't have. But no one said you shouldn't be raising money right now. And if they did, it wasn't hey, you need to figure a few more things out before you raise money. It was like, this is going to be this is a really big undertaking. You at least need a co-founder, and you should probably like go wait and figure this out, and maybe like take a year, kind of whatever. And so that, of course, as a stubborn individual, really frustrated me, and was like, I'm going to keep trying. And finally I hit my head against the wall too many times and was like, okay, no. And I eventually was like, fuck this. I'm not raising money. I'm going to do this my own way. I'm going to bootstrap. And by the time that happened was when the pandemic hit. So as terrible as it sounds, the pandemic was great for me to get my head back like screwed on correctly. And I was like, you know what? I'm not going to raise money. I'm just going to see what I can do with what I've got here. And we ended up having an incredible amount of people volunteer their time. And each one of those individuals helped us get to where we were next. And then it was very clear. We started getting conversations with health insurers, and they were progressing very well. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, it's just me doing this full time. If they happen to sign an agreement today, I'm screwed.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, okay, even if there was like a promise of getting paid at the end of this, I don't even know what this is going to entail. And so then I started really like looking at a business plan, looking at how much it's going to cost, the time, et cetera. And I was like, I have the things I didn't have the last time I went out to raise. And I understand that I can't do this without capital. Although it's a software company, it's a capital intensive, specific product. And so I went out to raise, and not only was it incredibly easier than the first time, it was still difficult, but it was much easier. It just started clicking, and yeah.
So almost like as soon as you weren't obsessing over the fact that you needed to raise was when it became a lot more straightforward in terms of
it's like
actually
when you
this
lose
is
your
why.
keys. It's like when you lose your keys and you're looking everywhere frantically and you can't find them. And you're like, this is impossible. I'm never going to find them. And as soon as you stop thinking about it, maybe go to the bathroom and answer the phone call, and you open the fridge and there they are in the fridge or something, you know?
I wish I know what you're saying. I wish that applied to me. It does not. But yeah, so like you also talked about how, you know, you hadn't started a company like this before. You met a whole bunch of entrepreneurs at all kind of different stages. Some maybe gave you advice that maybe wasn't super relevant at the stage.
Correct.
But that's kind of, that affects everybody if they are or you know, when they are starting out, because it is just you, you know, you are you were saying like it's just you, it's your business, you are the business. And if you know, you in a weird way, you're very willing to listen to somebody else's advice just because you don't want to do something wrong. And
Totally.
because of that, and you're probably very open to the fact that you hadn't done something before. So like how did you, I want to say, advance that, evolve that thinking while you were learning, so that you could maybe understand if this is a rabbit hole that you're at risk of falling down,
Totally.
or it's something that you actually need to lean into because you don't really know.
No, that's
you don't have
great.
experience with that, you know?
Yeah. And I think totally. Yeah. No, I think that's a great call out. And I think the attempt the first time to raise money was a great learning in that for me. So I think two things became abundantly clear to me. One, I need to be honest and frank about what it is that I don't know. So that's kind of one thing. And then the second is I need to get really clear on who I listen to and who I don't. So instead of, there's a point where I think you have to take in all this information from everyone. You know, I was talking to anyone who would listen to me. And then I think as you start further solidifying, that becomes a lot more narrow. And then once you've latched on to what is the idea and it's very concrete, I think you have to get really, really specific and even more narrow on those you seek opinions from or advice or wisdom from. And that it always draws back to what is it that I don't know, and who are the individuals that I trust who know more about this than I do.
Yeah, being open about what you don't know is a risky thing to do if you identify as a perfectionist, but also if you you're putting yourself out there, you're being vulnerable by saying I don't know how to do this stuff, and and that also makes you susceptible to being to being made felt shitty because well, why are you in this in the first place? Why are you doing this in the first place? And that's a tough thing to be able to say, yep, understand that, and that's why I'm doing it.
Yeah.
At the same
Well,
time.
and I think especially once you've raised money and you have the title of CEO and you have employees, there's this I think misunderstanding that you are expected to know everything.
Yeah, you're done, you're good. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a really, really kind of good distillation of the kind of CEO mentality is like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to know everything, and I know pretty much nothing. And
yeah, exactly. I think the more I do this, the older I get, the more I'm like, yeah, I know next to nothing.
Yeah. So getting back to Gabbi itself, first off, like, why is it called Gabbi?
Yeah, great question. So my mom's name is Lisa Gabrielle Clark.
Okay.
And so Gabbi comes from her middle name, Gabrielle. And then the second component really, I think not only is it an homage to my mom, but to who she was and who I am as an individual and our inherent similarities, but the inherent similarities in women. So, my mom and I are both outspoken, opinionated, loud women, and a lot of times got criticized for being that. But I think one of the strongest characteristics of women in general is that we share information with one another. So there's this play on words of empowering women to gab about their health and their bodies. Yeah.
That's great. It's a lovely background, but also it fits so well from a branding perspective. I guess it sounds really appropriate.
Well, so that's actually another example of one of those things that when you're like naming something is, oh my gosh, like shoot me now. I don't want to name a thing ever again. But I remember I was in New York City and I bought a thesaurus at the Strand and was walking around New York City with a thesaurus. And like whenever a word would come to me, I would sit down on a bench or somewhere and just like sit and start reading and start playing around and messing in my head. And literally it wasn't until, I don't even remember exactly when it happened. I was certainly not walking around New York City with a thesaurus or a whiteboard or anything. And I was just like, oh my gosh, Gabbi, my mom, me, the whole thing, no brainer. And of course I immediately go to see if it's trademarked and I'm like,
But it always happens that way. And, also you probably also looked up, well, what are all these words in Latin? What are all these words in all these
or a different language.
Exactly, different language. And then slightly different spelling.
Yep, exactly.
Thinking back to something that you were just saying about expectations, I also think I'd love to ask about, because especially since Gabbi is about health, you are in health tech, you are in the health space, and yet being a founder, being an entrepreneur, is inherently assumed that if you're doing it the right way, you are unhealthy objectively. You work all the time, you're never more than 5 minutes away from a response. How do you take that approach, and how do you think that do you think it's mostly pressure that we put on ourselves to kind of be always on, always responsive, and maybe not take care of ourselves? Or do you think that it's this perception that investors have? Like, how do you approach self-care and making sure that you are taking care of your own mental health going through this? Because as you said, like, it's a very lonely experience. You are constantly reminded that you know nothing. So, how do you actually take care of yourself in that way so that you can be efficient and effective?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm still figuring it out myself. I do think it's a combination of both. I think there's this societal, and whether we want to say, investors or industry or whatever, expectations that are put on us as founders. And then, I don't think we would be founders if we didn't have high standards ourselves. And so I think it's also self-inflicted. So I think when you are able to manage your own expectations that you put on yourself, then you're able to manage the expectations that others put on you. So it's been a lot of figuring out what makes me the healthiest, what makes me the best person. And so like, I know routine is really important for me. I know that I need exercise and I need it in the beginning of the day to get me going, because I won't do it at the end of the day. I know that I may enjoy a glass of wine, but anything over 2, I'm not going to be great the next day. I know that I do better working and being productive around people. So like Gabbi having offices is important, not only for our culture, but really for me to not be doing everything and never go outside because I'm working out of my home, 24/7. Sleep is something I didn't put a lot of weight into historically, and am trying to more now. I've always been really conscious about nutrition and diet. So, but I always, veer off that path and have to reset. And for me, therapy, I mean, I think every human ever should have a therapist. But I certainly think every founder should have a therapist. So the first thing I invested in personally before we had any funding and we were bootstrapped and I hadn't had a salary in multiple years and was really unsure like how I was going to pay my rent in 4 months, the first thing I invested in was paying for a therapist. And at first it was just like, I can just do once a month. And then I was able to go to twice a month. So I think that's been a huge thing too for me.
And all of the stuff, like it sounds healthy, right? But but at the same time, I could even tell when you were saying it, you're kind of feeling like, yeah, but you're not allowed to say this. You're not allowed to say that you need this stuff. Like you saying that you need an office because it is good for you. It's like, well, are people going to judge me in this way? Or like, are people going to say, well, why are you splurging for an office?
That's a frivolous expense. Yeah,
exactly. A frivolous expense. But at the end of the day, like, no one thinks about you as much as you think they do.
I know, that's actually so true.
It is. And you think, oh my God, how are the investors gonna take this? And they're like, okay, yeah, whatever. And I think it's more the perception or the concern that you might be doing something just to show that you're doing something and you're behaving a particular way. Like you're answering that text at 1 a.m. on purpose so that they know that you're up at 1 a.m. That's when it gets true. I don't want to say a curse word, mind F yourself, like that's, it's a, and it really is like whatever works for you. I think being aware that you don't know what works for you. You probably have a whole bunch of things that you'd love to be able to do, that your routine could be much better. But if you do find stuff that works for you, who in their right mind would actually say, you know what, actually, I'd like you to stop doing that. I'd like you to stop being, no one's going to say that, that's bullshit.
No, totally. Yeah. I think another key learning for me too, because, all those things are great. And I think they help me show up as a better leader, as a better human, also a better friend, a better romantic partner, whatever it may be. But our minds tend to always be spinning, I think, as founders or as CEOs. And one of our investors gave me a piece of advice that I was like, oh, I could never do that. And I'm really, really trying to do it because I've seen the tangible difference in how I am able to show up the next day. And he was like, at the beginning of the day, make a list of the 3 most important things that day. And when you're done with that list, you're done working for the day. And I've even tried, so one, it makes you really be specific about what those 3 things are, because if it's answer all my emails, like 1, that's not going to happen in one day. And 2, so it's never going to be done. So you can self-sabotage with that too, which I was definitely doing early on. But it really makes you look at, okay, what is going to move the business forward? What is waiting on me? What are these 3 things? And then it makes you stop so that you can rest, rejuvenate, and recover, and show up the next day to do the same thing. Because I could answer emails literally all night. I could research and read new articles all night. And your work's never done.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have the boundaries on yourself. Otherwise, you're going to wear out. And I think that's when burnout happens.
Absolutely. Like you have, if you answer your emails only twice a day and you get through however many you get, you'll find out that like people aren't emailing you saying, excuse me, why didn't you respond to me, an hour after I messaged? They just don't care. Like you still get back to them, but yet you still have all this, all this time. I think that's exactly right. I think seeing it as whether or not you're done for the day, or every other minute is then bonus time, or figuring out how you work. Like then you probably have done the same things, but with a different mindset. You'll be excited. I was talking about the happy warrior mentality versus the nervous worrier mentality, and they're very similar in terms of the activities that you might do, but they're very different in terms of the approach that you might take, and one will mean that you're naturally more successful than the other. And so anything you can anything that you can use to hack into that mentality is powerful, and even just giving time to think about the business, as you're saying,
that's huge. So everyone at my company, and I think who knows me personally, knows that I am like, I can't wait until I have a full-time assistant or just an assistant who is in charge of my calendar and has to say no to me, because I don't know, I consciously, unconsciously F myself over by just like back to back meetings. And by the end of the week, I'm like, I've literally had no time to think about anything. So having time just to think about the business is super important. Another thing, this same investor, David Kidder, who's a serial entrepreneur and really like has given me some of the best advice I've ever received, is saying, you can't live under the myth of control. And he gives this example of Navy SEALs that I'll probably butcher, but that with Navy SEALs, there's two different cohorts, and the cohorts that are the ones that like make it to the end are called optimizers, and they fail 90% of the time. But the optimizers, when it counts, are excelling at greater rates than the others who are in the cohort 2. And the other part is that the optimizers, the ones who pull the other guys over the wall, and the other guys pull them over. So there's this like camaraderie, the support aspect that is saying, you can't do this on an island. You need others.
That's a really great, not only image, but also source. If you're using Navy SEALs as that example, you can't tap into that internal monologue to say, well, they're not serious. That's not right. That's
so, and especially when you think about it, they're probably some of the most strong, athletic, rigorous, tenacious, disciplined individuals. And yet if they're the ones who are, they're failing 90% of the time, what makes me think that I'm going to have a better success?
Who am I? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I need to get through these 3 things. Come on. Cool. That's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes just to chat with me, Kaitlin. It was really interesting. And if people would like to learn more about Gabbi, you can visit begabbi.com. That's BEGABBI.com, or you can search for Kaitlin on LinkedIn. That's Kaitlin with a K. And you're also on Twitter at the KK Christine. Is that right? Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, thanks again, Kaitlin, for giving a bit of your time today.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun.
Yeah.